The red light was on. The cameras were perfectly positioned. 3,000 people filled the Hammersmith Apollo with that electric energy that always accompanied Britain's Got Talent tapings. It was a Wednesday evening in May 2024, and the audition rounds were reaching their climax. At the judges' table sat Simon Cowell in his signature black t-shirt, looking relaxed and engaged. Amanda Holden radiated glamour in a stunning red dress. Alesha Dixon was warm and encouraging as always. David Walliams had the audience laughing with his pre-show banter. None of them knew that in exactly 8 minutes and 43 seconds, one contestant would do something that had never been done in the history of Britain's Got Talent. She would reject a golden buzzer, and then she would destroy Simon Cowell's carefully constructed public image with a truth bomb that would dominate headlines for months. The production assistant's voice came through the speakers. Next up we have Grace Matthews, 25 years old, from Manchester. A young woman walked onto the stage with unusual composure. Grace Matthews was striking, tall, with dark hair cascading past her shoulders and eyes that held something most contestants didn't have. Not nervousness, not excitement, something closer to determination, or perhaps purpose. She wore a simple black dress and carried herself with the poise of someone who'd been preparing for this moment for a very long time. She walked to the microphone and stood there, looking directly at the judges' table, specifically at Simon Cowell, with an intensity that made him shift slightly in his seat. Amanda leaned forward with her characteristic warmth. "Hello, darling. What's your name?" "Grace Matthews. I'm 25, and I'm from Manchester." Her voice was steady, clear, completely in control. "And what are you going to do for us today?" Alesha asked. "I'm going to sing an original song," Grace said. "It's called The Truth You Buried." Something about the title made Simon's eyebrow raise. Original songs were risky on Britain's Got Talent. They often weren't as immediately impactful as well-known covers. But there was something in Grace's delivery, in the way she said the title, that suggested this wasn't just any original song. "That's a powerful title," David said. "What inspired it?" Grace looked directly at Simon. "Personal experience. Sometimes the truth gets buried for years, but eventually, it has to come out, even if it destroys everything." The audience made an appreciative sound, thinking this was just artistic drama. Amanda nodded encouragingly. Alesha smiled. David looked intrigued. And Simon, who'd heard thousands of contestants talk about their emotional journeys, their personal struggles, their need to tell their truth, didn't recognize the specific threat in Grace's words. "Whenever you're ready," Simon said, his tone professional and kind. The music track began. A haunting piano melody filled the Apollo, simple but emotionally devastating. Grace closed her eyes, took a breath, and began to sing. Her voice was extraordinary, not just technically proficient, but emotionally raw in a way that immediately captivated everyone in the studio. She sang about secrets buried deep, about lies told to protect powerful people, about children growing up without fathers, about women who died because no one believed them. The lyrics were poetic but pointed, vague enough to be universal, specific enough to feel personal. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. Amanda had tears in her eyes within the first verse. Alesha was leaning forward, captivated. David was nodding along, recognizing genuine artistry. And Simon was listening with that intense focus he reserved for performances that genuinely moved him. But there was something else in his expression, a slight furrow in his brow, a tension in his shoulders, like some part of him recognized that this song, these words, were somehow about him. Grace sang about a woman who'd been silenced, who'd been told her truth was a lie, who'd been paid to disappear. She sang about a daughter who grew up wondering why her father never wanted to meet her. She sang about powerful men who thought money could bury anything. When she reached the final chorus, her voice soared, powerful and accusatory and heartbreaking all at once. The last note hung in the air, and then silence. Complete, absolute silence. Then the Hammersmith Apollo exploded. 3,000 people rose to their feet in spontaneous, thunderous applause. Amanda was crying openly. Alesha was on her feet immediately. David was applauding vigorously. And Simon Cowell was standing at the judges' table, with an expression that very few people had ever seen on his face. He looked genuinely moved, vulnerable. His eyes were actually glistening with tears. He waited for the applause to die down. Then he spoke. "Grace." His voice was thick with emotion. "In 18 years of doing this show, I have heard thousands of original songs. Most of them are forgettable. Some are good. Very, very few are extraordinary. What you just did was extraordinary." The audience cheered. Grace stood at the microphone, completely composed, watching Simon. That song, Simon continued, spoke to something universal about truth, about courage, about refusing to let your story be silenced. You are exactly what this show is about. You are exactly the kind of artist I want to champion. He paused for dramatic effect, and everyone in the studio knew what was coming. Simon Cowell's hand moved toward the golden buzzer. Grace Matthews, I'm going to do something I reserve for very special moments. His hand hovered over the golden buzzer. You're going straight to the semi-finals. He slammed his hand down on the golden buzzer. The alarm sounded. Golden confetti began falling from the ceiling. The theme music exploded through the speakers. Amanda, Alesha, and David all rose to give Grace a standing ovation. The audience went absolutely wild. This was the moment, the peak, the celebration that every Britain's Got Talent contestant dreams of. And Grace Matthews stood in a shower of golden confetti, watching it fall around her, and she didn't smile. She raised her microphone. The celebration was so loud that at first no one heard her speak, but the cameras caught it. The close-up microphones picked it up, and slowly, starting with the people closest to the stage, a strange silence began to spread through the Apollo. Grace spoke 5 words that changed everything. I don't want your golden buzzer. The confetti continued to fall. The music continued to play for a few more seconds before someone in the control room cut it. Simon's triumphant smile began to falter. Amanda looked confused. The audience's cheering died into confused murmurs. What? Simon said, his voice barely audible. Grace stepped closer to the edge of the stage, closer to the judges' table, and when she spoke again, her voice was clear and steady and absolutely devastating. I didn't come here to win Britain's Got Talent. I came here to tell the truth about you, Simon Cowell. And now I have 3,000 witnesses and cameras recording everything, and you can't walk away. The Hammersmith Apollo fell into complete silence. Simon's face went from confused to something else, a flicker of fear perhaps, or recognition that something very bad was about to happen. I don't understand, Simon said, but his voice suggested that maybe he was beginning to. Grace reached into a hidden pocket in her dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. My mother's name was Catherine Matthews. Does that name mean anything to you? Simon's face went white. Actually white. The color drained from his face so quickly that Amanda reached out to steady him, thinking he might collapse. Catherine Matthews, Grace continued, her voice getting stronger, was a backup singer on one of your music production shows in 19... She was 28 years old. She was talented, beautiful, and she made the mistake of having a brief relationship with you. The audience was so silent you could hear the golden confetti still settling on the stage. She got pregnant, Grace said. With me. And when she told you, you told her it couldn't be yours. That she was lying. That she was trying to trap you. You gave her £50,000 and a non-disclosure agreement and told her to disappear. Amanda's hands went to her mouth. Alesha looked horrified. David was staring at Simon with an expression of dawning comprehension. The NDA said she couldn't tell anyone about the relationship or the pregnancy or the payment. But she told her mother, my grandmother, on her deathbed. Because she wanted someone to know the truth. And that truth was that you were my father, and you'd abandoned us both. Simon found his voice. This is not appropriate. This is appropriate? Grace's voice rose. You want to talk about appropriate? You rejected my mother from Britain's Got Talent 15 years ago, 2009. She auditioned for this show, this exact show, hoping that maybe if she became successful you'd acknowledge me. You'd see her and remember. But you didn't remember her. You told her she'd never make it, that she should give up on music and focus on being a mother. Your exact words were some people are meant to sing, and some people are meant to be parents. You're clearly the latter. The audience gasped. Those were harsh words, even by Simon's standards. 3 months after that rejection, Grace continued, and now her voice was shaking with emotion. My mother took her own life. She left a note saying she'd tried everything, that even the father of her child didn't believe in her, that she'd never be good enough for anything. Tears were streaming down Grace's face now, but her voice remained strong. I was 10 years old, and I spent the next 15 years wondering why my father never wanted to meet me, why he'd paid my mother to disappear, why his rejection destroyed her so completely that she couldn't keep living. Simon tried to speak. This isn't true. Grace unfolded the paper she'd been holding. This is a DNA test. I had it conducted 3 months ago, using a sample I obtained legally from your discarded coffee cup outside this building. The lab is accredited, the chain of custody is documented, and the results show a 99.8% probability that you are my biological father. She held the paper up toward the cameras. The cameramen, despite the chaos in the control room, kept filming. This was too significant to stop. I waited until I turned 25, because that's when the NDA my mother signed expired. She was smart enough to limit its term. She wanted me to have the option to speak the truth someday, even if she couldn't. Grace looked directly at Simon. So here I am, on your show, after earning your golden buzzer, and I'm telling 3,000 people and millions of viewers that you are my father, that you abandoned me, that your rejection contributed to my mother's suicide, and that for 15 years I've grown up wondering what was so wrong with me that my own father didn't want to know me. The Hammersmith Apollo erupted. Not in applause, in chaos. People shouting, some booing, some crying. Security was rushing toward the stage. Producers were screaming into headsets. Amanda was crying. Alesha looked stunned. David was pale, and Simon Cowell stood at the judges' table, absolutely frozen, unable to form words. Grace wasn't finished. You pressed your golden buzzer for me. You said you wanted to champion my art, but you've never championed me. You've never even acknowledged that I exist. So no, Simon Cowell, I don't want your golden buzzer. I don't want anything from you except for everyone to know the truth. She dropped the microphone. It hit the stage with a sharp crack of feedback, and Grace Matthews walked off the Britain's Got Talent stage, leaving golden confetti falling around an empty spotlight, and a judge who'd just had his darkest secret exposed on live television. The cameras cut. Too late. The broadcast had been live. Millions of people had just watched it happen, and within minutes, the clip was being shared across every social media platform in existence. The internet exploded. Grace Matthews trended worldwide within 20 minutes. Simon Cowell exposed followed shortly after. News outlets picked up the story immediately. Legal experts began analyzing the claims. Entertainment reporters started digging into Simon's past. And somewhere in Manchester, Grace Matthews sat in her hotel room and watched the chaos unfold, knowing that she'd finally done what she'd been planning for 15 years. She'd told the truth, and no amount of money, no NDA, no legal team could put that truth back in the box. The aftermath was volcanic. ITV immediately suspended production on Britain's Got Talent pending an investigation. Simon's lawyers issued a statement denying the allegations and threatening legal action. But then, unexpectedly, Grace's lawyers released more documentation. Not just the DNA test, but records of the £50,000 payment made to Catherine Matthews in 1999. A copy of the NDA, which was no longer enforceable. Bank statements showing regular payments that had continued until Catherine's death in 2009. Text messages between Simon and Catherine, from 1999, recovered from an old phone that Catherine had saved. And most damning of all, a letter that Simon had written to Catherine in 1999, telling her that he couldn't be a father, that his career was more important, that she needed to take care of the situation discreetly. The evidence was overwhelming. 3 days after the Britain's Got Talent incident, Simon Cowell's lawyers stopped denying and started negotiating. 1 week later, Simon released a public statement. 25 years ago, I made decisions I deeply regret. I had a brief relationship with Catherine Matthews that resulted in a pregnancy. I responded with fear and selfishness, rather than responsibility and compassion. I convinced myself that providing financial support was enough, and I hid behind a non-disclosure agreement rather than acknowledging the truth. I failed Catherine Matthews completely. My rejection of her audition for Britain's Got Talent in 2009 was done without recognizing who she was. I genuinely didn't remember her, which is perhaps the most damning indictment of my behavior. She was a person I'd been intimate with, the mother of my child, and I'd forgotten her. When she took her own life 3 months later, I had no idea I'd played any part in her despair. I should have. I failed her, and I failed my daughter Grace. I am ordering an independent DNA test to confirm what Grace's test has shown. If it confirms paternity, and I have no reason to doubt that it will, I want to meet my daughter, not to buy her silence, not to rehabilitate my image, but because she deserves a father who acknowledges her. Even if I can never make up for 25 years of absence, I am seeking professional help to understand how I could have behaved so callously, and to ensure I never treat another human being with such disregard again. The statement was carefully crafted by lawyers and publicists, but the sentiment felt genuine, or at least genuinely desperate. The independent DNA test was conducted under the supervision of 3 separate laboratories. It confirmed what Grace's test had shown. Simon Cowell was her biological father with a 99.9% probability. What happened next surprised everyone. Grace agreed to meet Simon, not on camera, not with lawyers present, just the two of them in a private room with a mediator who specialized in family reconciliation. No recording of that meeting has ever been released, But according to the mediator's later testimony in court, because yes, there were lawsuits, it was brutally honest. Grace told Simon exactly how his abandonment had affected her, how she'd grown up feeling fundamentally unworthy because her own father hadn't wanted her, how she'd watched her mother deteriorate mentally, knowing that part of that deterioration stemmed from Simon's rejection, how she'd spent 15 years planning this moment of public exposure because she'd believed it was the only way to make him understand the consequences of his actions. Simon, according to the mediator, did something unexpected. He listened. He didn't defend himself. He didn't make excuses. He didn't try to minimize what he'd done. He acknowledged every point Grace made, and he apologized. Not the public statement apology crafted by lawyers, a genuine, broken apology from a man confronting the worst thing he'd ever done. The meeting lasted 4 hours. When it ended, Grace and Simon didn't emerge as a reconciled father and daughter, but they emerged with an understanding. Grace would drop all legal claims in exchange for Simon establishing a foundation in Catherine Matthews's name, dedicated to supporting single mothers pursuing careers in music. The foundation would be funded with £10 million initially, with ongoing support. Simon would also publicly acknowledge Grace as his daughter, support her music career without any control over her artistic decisions, and commit to regular therapy sessions to work on their relationship. The Britain's Got Talent episode never aired in its original form. Instead, ITV created a documentary called The Golden Buzzer that changed everything, that included footage of the confrontation, interviews with Grace, statements from Simon, and discussions about accountability, NDAs, and the power dynamics in the entertainment industry. It aired 9 months after the incident, and was watched by 38 million people in the UK. It won a BAFTA, but more importantly, it started conversations about powerful men and the women they use and discard, about children who grow up without fathers, about the mental health impacts of rejection and abandonment, about whether NDAs should be legal in cases involving children, about accountability and redemption. Grace Matthews' music career took off, but not because of Simon's connections. Her song The Truth You Buried was released independently and went viral. It hit #1 on the UK charts. Her debut album, dedicated to her mother's memory, went platinum, and she did it entirely on her own terms, turning down multiple offers from Simon's record label and others who wanted to capitalize on the scandal. Simon Cowell took a 6-month hiatus from all television projects. He entered therapy. He began making private donations to women's shelters and single-parent support organizations. When he returned to Britain's Got Talent for the next season, he was different. Not dramatically, but noticeably. He was more careful with his words, more aware of the impact of rejection, more willing to see contestants as complete human beings rather than just performers. In his first episode back, he addressed what had happened. I made terrible mistakes that hurt people I should have protected. I'm trying to be better. I'm trying to understand the power I have and use it more responsibly. I will probably fail sometimes, but I'm trying. It wasn't a redemption arc. Not really, because some things can't be redeemed, only acknowledged and learned from. Grace and Simon's relationship remained complicated. They met occasionally. Simon attended her concerts, sitting in the back where photographers couldn't catch him. Grace accepted his financial support for the foundation, but nothing for herself. They were never going to be a typical father and daughter. Too much time had passed, too much damage had been done, but they found something, an understanding, a fragile connection built on brutal honesty and acknowledgement of harm, and sometimes, that's the best you can hope for. 5 years after the incident, in an interview for a documentary about her life, Grace was asked if she regretted exposing Simon so publicly. Her answer was simple, no. Because if I'd done it privately, if I'd accepted his money and stayed silent, nothing would have changed. He'd still be the man who thought he could pay people to disappear. The only reason he changed, if he really did change, was because the whole world saw what he'd done. Public exposure was the only thing powerful enough to force accountability. She paused, then added, my mother died believing she wasn't good enough. That Simon Cowell, this powerful man, had confirmed her worst fears about herself. I wanted the world to know that she was good enough, that she was talented and worthy and beautiful, and that the person who wasn't good enough was him. He wasn't good enough to be her partner. He wasn't good enough to be my father. Not until he finally took responsibility. The golden buzzer that was rejected became a symbol, not of Grace's rejection of fame, but of her refusal to accept validation from someone who'd failed to validate her when it mattered most. The moment taught Britain's Got Talent, and reality television as a whole, that some truths are more important than entertainment, that some moments transcend the show, and that sometimes the most powerful performance isn't the one that earns applause. It's the one that forces people to confront uncomfortable truths. Simon Cowell's golden buzzer had launched hundreds of careers, but Grace Matthews used it for something different. She used it as a weapon, a spotlight, a truth bomb that exposed the man behind the judge and forced a reckoning that was 25 years overdue. The confetti has long since been cleaned up. The stage has hosted thousands of performers since, but the moment remains, preserved in video, in memory, in the cultural conversation. The moment when Grace Matthews stood in a shower of golden confetti and chose truth over triumph. Because some things are worth more than winning, and sometimes the most important thing you can say is no.